Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Bound by Grace, where we dive in deep into faith, healing, and the beautiful complexities of relationships. I'm your host, Amber, and today's episode is one that speaks to the heart of resilience, commitment, and spiritual grounding. We're honored to welcome a very special guest, Beth Runkle. Beth is a military missionary, a gifted speaker, and an author whose voice brings both wisdom and compassion to those navigating the unique challenges of military life. Her passion for supporting military couples is deeply rooted in her own journey, and her work continues to inspire and uplift countless families. She also has been featured on Focus on the Family as well as Military Spouse magazine, bringing insight to a wider audience seeking faith based encouragement in marriage. In today's episode, we're going to be navigating a military marriage. We'll be talking about love under pressure, how deployments, transitions, and spiritual warfare shape a marriage, and how couples can cling into God's promises through all of it. Beth, welcome to Bound by Grace. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you, Amber. It's an honor to be with you, and I appreciate you allowing me just to take a little bit of the military family's journey to your listeners.
Yeah, we're very excited about it. So I want to go ahead and dive right in. So what we want to start with are what are some practical conversations that couples should have before deployment to prepare emotionally, financially, and spiritually?
Yeah, well, first of all, deployment is when your service member is gone for months at a time. It can usually be 6 months to 18 months or more. And what really happens during that time is the service member kind of has to step out of a lot of those roles because they're going to be gone. It's gotten a lot easier now with online banking and things like that. But there are some physical, emotional, and spiritual changes that need to happen. First of all, one of the things that my husband and I have always advised military couples to do is use some of the extra money that you're going to make because your pay will not be taxed if you're deployed overseas, and invest that in some things to help the spouse that is at home.
And
And that's not going to
we usually get separation pay, don't we?
Yes, yes. So
Yeah,
there's
so there's
there's a
extra.
lot of extra pay. Now, some people will go into a deployment with like, "Great, this is an opportunity to pay down our debt." And I'm not saying that's bad, but you also have to invest in what's going to help the spouse that stays at home with the kids better be able to cope. So I'll tell people like, yeah, you can save some money or maybe pay down some debt during this time, but also we have to be willing to invest some resources and things that are going to make it more manageable. For example, we invested in lawn care help. Is that something I can do? Yes. But it when the particular home that we were at, it was taking me 3 hours on a Saturday to take care of the lawn. And so eventually we began to see, yes, this is something I can do, but it elevates my stress. So you have to figure out what that's going to be for you. Once we had kids, it was like, a once a week babysitter for me. It might be
Yeah.
house cleaning services, it might be grocery delivery, whatever is going to make it more manageable. So I think it's really good to have an upfront conversation about, hey, what things can we outsource for this period of time? Yes, I know you can do them. But I think spouses can tend to take on too much and try to be like Superman or Superwoman. When really I found that in deployment, less is actually more. Um, Less activities that we're doing, less things that are on my plate so that I can minimize my stress so that I can be all in and patient, because I am it. I'm the sole parent during the times when my service member's gone. And then also, there's all these things that are actually going to come up. We call it Murphy's Law. The dishwasher's going to break, the car's going to break, the kids are all going to get the stomach
Every
flu
time.
week one.
Yep.
Uh, so I also think it's important to talk about how are we going to communicate when you are deployed? And this is something we keep talking about, but we need to set expectations. For example, a lot of service members, when they're deployed, can't handle you just popping in on FaceTime periodically because depending upon what their job is in the military, they might be dealing with something really heavy. For example, I have a friend who tells me a story about how she just called her husband on the cell phone, picked up, and she can hear gunfire and overhead and all this chaos. Her spouse wasn't able to talk to her, but what did that do? It put her into just a flurry of extreme anxiety and fear. And so we have to protect ourselves too. So what really worked well for us was to say, hey, we're going to have a scheduled time that if everything goes perfectly, we're going to chat during that time. And it doesn't always go perfectly because duty calls often.
Right. Right.
But that set time so that I'm just not picking up my phone or texting, not knowing what's going on. And when someone is deployed, they can tend to need to compartmentalize things more. I think men compartmentalize anyway, but especially when they're deployed, doing war conditions or warlike conditions, they might need to compartmentalize. So I had to resist that temptation to just be reaching out because I could and really set aside that time. And also, if he calls me and I'm dealing with two toddlers throwing tantrums, I'm not going to be really good to connect with at that point either because my stress level is going to be high. I might say things I don't mean. So come up with a communication plan, but then we have to adjust as well. We had to figure out, hey, there are times when we can't have our video call because something happened. So, we're going to send each other a Marco Polo. So we're still going to connect, remind each other that we love each other, but be okay when our plan doesn't go perfectly.
Yeah.
And I also think, you need to make sure you get the powers of attorneys and things like that before they leave in the event that there are things that come up that you have to handle. And your base or post legal services office can help you with those things. And then spiritually, yes, they are free. Great services. And spiritually, I think there's some things that you can do to plan as well. I think sometimes we can go in with either too low of an expectation or too high of an expectation when it comes to spiritual expectations. So it's probably not realistic that your service member is going to be able to lead family in devotion every single day. That's probably not realistic, right? But maybe you and your spouse could read a devotional together or read the same book of the Bible where you're studying the same thing on the
Yes.
same days. You know, Realistically, you're not going to be able to talk about it every day because life happens. Life happens for the person at home, but also the person that's overseas. Maybe it's even reading a book together, as you go throughout, but something that can keep you connected on a spiritual level. And I think we have to continue to have these conversations about what's working, what's not working. For example, for my spouse, if I was like, every time I connected with him, hey, how are you spiritually feeling? What is your thoughts about what we read today? That might be too much of an expectation, but letting him talk about it when it's a good time for him to talk about it. And you just flexibility is key and extending each other grace.
Oh, absolutely. We had a podcast episode on grace in marriage. That is one of the highest things that are important in marriage. But
And
I'm glad
unfortunately, we tend to give our spouse sometimes the least amount of grace.
we do. We absolutely do. Um, I'm so glad we're talking about this. This is almost perfect timing for myself. I don't know about our listeners, but my husband is due to deploy in February.
Oh,
And
I'm sorry
Hawaii
to
is
hear that,
not our
Amber.
home. So, this is what you stated about investing in your spouse that's at home and
Yes.
doing things like lawn care or a night where she gets to have a babysitter.
Yes.
I didn't ever think about that and how amazing that would be.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a simple thing. And I know when my husband was deployed, once a month babysitter, that was a given for me because that's what I needed for some self care so that I
Yes.
could manage things day to day. But, all the things happen. But that gave me some time when I knew I could invest in myself. And honestly, sometimes that time for me looked like going to the grocery store by myself,
Yeah.
which is wonderful when instead of people fighting and hitting each other and screaming. But sometimes it was to go to a coffee shop and open my Bible and feed myself with the truth that I
Yeah.
know I needed to hear. So it just looked different, but I knew I needed that time to just decompress and get a break.
Just so
And
smart.
yes, I could do all these things. I can do lawn care. Most military
Right.
spouses are very independent, very capable.
Hmm.
But if we can keep our stress level lower by outsourcing some of these things, I think it's
Hmm.
really beneficial.
I think that's so smart. Just for
Well,
self care.
learned
It's
the
so
wrong
smart
way sometimes. Yes.
because you are capable. I take on everything when he leaves
Mhm.
when I don't have to.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we set these unrealistic expectations like, so we're going to have a themed day once a week, and I'm going to take the kids to the amusement park, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And we add so many things to our calendar that we have given ourselves no room to deal with the anxiety and the stress of just the everyday and not having adult conversation. So I really learned no, less is more. Take things off the calendar when my spouse is deployed. That doesn't mean that we don't have little milestones that we look forward to and little things like, I don't know, saying, you know what? Dad's gone. We're going to have ice cream for dinner tonight. You know, that's a
Yeah,
great thing. Also, by the way, cereal is an acceptable dinner when your
I
spouse is deployed.
I agree. That's amazing.
Yeah, but it's also like not having these unrealistic expectations of how awesome it's going to be because we actually can't juggle everything. And it's not just that we can't do it, but we also can't do it without another human being just to help us deal with the daily stressors and to have that adult conversation. Because, when your spouse is deployed, sometimes you can go days without talking to an adult. And
Yes.
that just helps us be able to better cope. So I learned less is more, and I could be a better mom and a better spouse and better handle things if I actually took things off my plate.
And I want to touch back on just in case some of our listeners have never had a spouse deploy, and that is a very, very realistic thing that could be coming up in their future.
Mhm.
Um, Ladies, be prepared, and men. Whenever your military spouse deploys, something goes wrong that
Within
doesn't
a few
while they're
days.
home.
Mhm.
Something will break that doesn't normally break. It is an automatic thing, and us seasoned spouses, we know it.
Yeah, I learned to begin to prepare myself for the things that were gonna happen. I don't know what it's gonna be, but to set the expectation for myself, something major is gonna go wrong with the house or the car or the kids or likely both. And also that another conversation that we began to learn to have is who can Beth call when that thing does happen, because we didn't ever live anywhere near
Yes.
family.
Right.
Who's another military family? Maybe they're not with my husband's unit, so they're not going to be deployed.
Yep.
Who, Beth can reach out to with, hey, I really need help with this. Or, there were times where we had neighbors that were older that were available to help. But just to kind of go ahead and have a plan again, not me saying I'm weak, I can't do this, but for example, I had mold take over my entire house one time when my husband's deployed. I didn't know what to do. We couldn't figure it out, so I had to get some people to help me figure out what is causing all this mold.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that it makes you less capable or seem less capable. Having help really takes a lot of strength to even ask for.
Yes.
So I think that it just, you need to allow yourself to be worth asking that help for that help.
Yeah. And I think in general, especially other military families, they like to help because they know what it's like. And I think it's a sense of pride that we won't ask others for help.
It is. It is a sense of pride. Okay, that's really great on that. What role does prayer play in anchoring your heart when someone is missing their spouse? How can they pray for and with them even from afar?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of blog posts that I've written on different areas you can pray over your service member, but something that's not in the blog post is just how I came to realize what an important weapon prayer is. And
Yes.
also realize that if I did not use this weapon, it was like I was serving in the military and I was walking out to battle having left my gun back in the barracks, right? We would never do that. That'd be so dumb. But yet we think that we can do the everyday battles of life without that weapon and without that protection over our service member, which, let's face it, they have physical danger, they have emotional danger, they have spiritual danger. We need to cover them. And so, an analogy I like to use to help people understand is that in all branches of the military now, we are using laser guided weapons. And what that does is it helps them be much more precise. I think the US military is by far the greatest military, and it comes down to our training, but also the technology of our weapons. And so my husband used to use laser guided weapons when he flew the F 117 stealth fighter. But all of our special forces use these. It's just a laser scope that we put onto any weapon. And wherever we place that laser, the weapon will hit. So my husband used to fly 10,000 feet above his targets. He could place a laser on a particular window on the third floor of a building. Wherever he had that laser, the bomb would hit every single time. And that's because of the incredible accuracy. I believe prayer is our laser guided weapon as that military spouse. But sadly, I think we just leave that weapon on the ground and we don't realize the immense power. This power is even greater than our US military because we are calling down the power of heaven into our circumstances. So, absolutely, we need to bathe our family and our spouse in prayer for all of these things. And one of my favorite scriptures to use to help guide my prayers is Psalm 91. And it talks about God being a fortress. I love it because it actually uses a lot of military terms talking about how God is our protection, God is our strength, God is our source. But like I said, I've got 2 other blog posts on different areas you can pray. You can pray over their thought life, over their temptations. You can pray for their work and their ability to be a good soldier or airman or Navy, midshipman, whatever their different role is. We need to cover them in prayer and recognize what an incredible responsibility and privilege we have to be able to cover them in prayer.
Absolutely. That's very well put. We're actually going to be doing an episode that'll be released later this month, The Power of a Praying Wife.
Oh,
And
awesome. Well, I actually mentioned that in the blog post, Stormy
yes,
O'Martin's book.
so I was going to state that too. Your blog is on your website, correct?
Yes, if you just go
So,
under the blogs, the title of it is Tips for Being Your Military Man's Battle Buddy in Prayer. And it's a
oh,
two-part
I love
blog.
that.
I've got 10 different areas that you can pray over for your military member.
That's beautiful. So, if any listeners want to reach out and look at her blogs or anything that she has on her website is actually linked in her guest spotlight on our website. So, just go to boundbygracepodcast.com and go under guest speakers and find Beth Runkle, and you'll see her website there.
Yeah, and it's just my name, Beth Runkle, which is Runkle.
Yes, perfect. If kids are in the picture, how do you involve them in supporting the deployed parent through letters, prayers, creative routines?
Yes. So, first of all, I do have a lot of great ideas, but I also say that you know your children best and you know their developmental point and where they are spiritually, emotionally, physically. For example, I've got some great ideas that would not work with a young kid. For example, a 2 or 3 year old often cannot understand video chat with mom or dad that are deployed. It actually upsets them and makes them more upset. But I do have some ideas, but I want to give that blanket to say, you know your kids best and try some different things. My first idea is to have a visual. So I like the idea of a clear jar with candy kisses, and they get the kisses go down as the number of days, closer to when dad approaches. The reason I like the kisses is because, the military doesn't always follow through with when they said mom or dad was going to come home. Duty
Yeah.
calls. And so I like the kisses because you can add some kisses if the timeline adjusts a little bit.
Yeah.
Another idea is like a chain, maybe you could put a good memory on there or just a chain, that you break off a paper chain every day. That is also something that you can add to, but I think it helps them have something visual as a reminder. And maybe you don't count down the number of days, but they see, hey, the candy kiss jar is half full, like we've made it halfway. I also really like putting a map on the wall before mom or dad leaves and them, pointing out with a thumbtack or something like, hey, this is where I'm going to be. And this is where you guys are. And then you can even put up a clock that shows the time where mom or dad are. And it's just a way to help the kids connect with, like, that's where dad is. And wow, it's morning for us, but daddy's sleeping. Just something that they can have that visual. I also think it's really important to get the kids involved to the extent that they are able. So we would do care packages. Sometimes we might send some baked goods. Sometimes we just went to the store, the BX, and picked out some things. Maybe they helped me pick out some things they thought their dad might like, some granola bars, some snacks. And then the main thing my kids did was like some artwork to send with that. So, like some pictures, some cards, maybe even just decorating the inside of the box. If my kids were really little, it was some scribbling, but it was something to remind them that dad exists, that is real. We're going to send him this package. I do also think it's important to create some time for connection between dad and kids. But again, this depends on the age. So some kids can't handle that video call. Obviously, older kids can. And I would encourage maybe like a one-on-one date for kid and dad.
Yeah.
And then you can do book reading. So you could get 2 copies of a book and, dad can read parts of it. That's probably not going to happen every day. And sometimes that works better to record prior to when they leave. And, the kids can watch a video of dad reading them a book. I'm sure you've seen the little cuddly stuffed mom and
Yes.
dad in uniform. I think those are great. I think it's something good, something tangible to give them, that they can hold on to. Or, let's be honest, sometimes there's tears and we just want to hold on to that.
Yeah.
Um, so I also believe in investing in some resources to help our kids. So there are lots of books for younger kids. There are some books for older kids. There's some podcasts for older kids. Just investing in some things for them to realize I'm not the only one that is dealing with mom or dad deployed. I'm not the only one, something to help. You better have that conversation. There's so many great books out in the market for your kids to talk about, mom or dad's away, or, we see his boots and it reminds us that he's, across the ocean. And then honest talk here, counseling is an option.
Yes.
Military kids' lives are hard. My kids moved, 10 and 12 times in their lives. Dad was gone a lot. And so, there are lots of great resources free through your, post or your base. And also at times it's good to invest in that. And, our family did have to do some counseling at times. I had to do some counseling for myself, couples counseling, and our kids did need counseling at different times because yes, they're resilient. Yes, they're strong, but it's okay to wave that flag and say, hey, we need some help right now.
Yeah.
And then I do think it's important to remind them that they're not the only kids going through this. I like to actually go to the special functions that were hosted on a poster based for the military families because it allowed my kids to meet some other kids that mom or dad was gone for them too. And to realize they're not the only ones and kind of get them out of the pity party mentality that they might have at times. I'm not saying that we don't want to feel bad, but I don't think it's good to have a pity party and just wallow in our negative emotions.
Yeah.
Satan likes to throw us negative thoughts that sometimes are not true. Our emotions are very real, but they are not always true. Um, and then I think to help you be a better support for your kids, you have to also realize, as that spouse at home, you need to be a better support um, by cutting yourself some slack. So, getting the help, realizing that mac and cheese cereal, PB&J. At times, those can be an appropriate meal. You don't eat that way the whole time, but just giving yourself grace. And something I really recommend is involve your kids in praying for their mom or dad's safety. And that
Yeah,
can be done daily. And maybe you don't do it perfectly every single day. But, maybe set a goal once a week before we, go to bed or before we sit down for our meal. We're going to pray for their safety, their physical safety, their emotional, and their spiritual safety.
absolutely. For our listeners, just in case you're not aware, if you are off post and your kids go to public schools, there is usually a military advocate
Mhm.
that is at that school and they can be
Military
enrolled.
Family Life Advocacy Counselor
There
in
you go.
Slack. And
Yep.
they are embedded in a lot of schools where there's a lot of military kids. Yeah. So they don't even have to leave their school to get that counseling.
Yep. And sometimes they'll do group counseling. So
Hmm.
your kids can be involved with other military kids in their school system.
Yes. Which is great for helping them realize they're not the only one.
Exactly. So, how can families set realistic expectations for reintegration rather than assuming things will instantly go back to normal?
Well, first of all, I think that reintegration is the hardest part about deployment. It's just hard. You've been living separate lives. Often your service member has, they're on a completely different time schedule. They're jet lagged. They've been working through the nights. They've been dealing with soldiers and airmen, not toddlers and teenagers, which are very different. Toddlers and teenagers don't take orders. So it's an adjustment. You've been apart. For me, I had to learn how to let my husband back in to leadership in the home and kind of give up my reins of control. Because once you get into a rhythm, things are going pretty well. I
Yeah.
mean, it's still hard, but you get into a rhythm. And then you have to adjust that schedule and that rhythm to let your spouse back in. I think one of the first things is to really front grace for your spouse when they come home. So they often have not slept a lot because, they got to go on the rotators to get back. So they're very sleep deprived. They're on a different time schedule. And they've been in war or warlike conditions. So it's just a big shock to come back in with family and kids and loud. Um, so we have an adjustment period where I kind of just let my spouse observe instead of expecting for them to jump back into parenting because realistically, the kids have also changed. When children are children, their development is constantly always changing. And I don't know about you, Amber, but for me, like I was always trying something new, to manage them. So that's one of the things that we would do too prior to them coming home is like, honestly, I would usually send an email because then it was better for my husband to process, like, hey, this is what's going on the kids. These are the things that we're doing. This is my technique to try to get them to eat their meals now. This is how I'm doing bath time. Um, Not to say that I have all the answers, but to give them an idea of like where we're at, but then also allow them to observe for a few days before expecting. Now that was a shift for me because what I really want to do, my selfish nature, is I want to be like, hey, I have done this for 6 months. I'm exhausted. I want to like go away for a few days and like you do everything. Um, that's not fair. And I also think like allowing your service member to slowly adjust, get some sleep, unpack their luggage and all the things they had on deployment. I actually think that helps them process I am no longer downrange and now I'm coming back home and do all their little in processing they got to do before they get their permissive leave to come home and be with the family. And then understand they are going to be tired. And that just is like I have to not be so selfish because I really want them to come in and do everything. But they've had a hard too. I've had a hard as the one who stayed at home, but they've had it hard too. And I think that we get selfish when we want to be like, my hard was harder than your hard. And like the reality is we both had it hard. It's hard to be deployed. I mean, sometimes my husband worked like 6.5 days a week on deployment. Really, really long days, that's hard. Now, I had it hard with two kids and trying to keep the household running. That, neither one is easy. But I think we just have to try to put ourselves in their shoes and just lower those expectations. And then I think some of the things that you don't expect to be weird is like intimacy. You're like super excited and you think it's going to be a honeymoon. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's a little awkward. And
It is
honestly, you
after
can
some
feel
time.
anxious even though
Yeah.
you've been married to this person for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And that's not something I expected.
Uh-uh. I didn't either.
Yeah, you just kind of got to like give yourself some grace. And then I also think it takes 6 months about to kind of resettle and get a new rhythm. And I feel like there's a period where the conflict is going to bump up before it comes back down and you adjust. But I think expect that it's going to be an adjustment.
Yeah,
um,
I agree.
and we can't expect our spouse to come home and be perfect because they've had their own version of hard.
Yes. And
And I
they're
found it
going to
helpful to
relearn.
check in
Yeah.
communication wise, like, hey, how are we doing? How can I adjust? How can I support you better? And vice versa.
Yeah.
But not come at them with like, these are all the things that you're doing wrong.
Right. Because in reality, your spouse has to relearn those routines and
Hmm.
possible routines that you put in place while they were gone.
Yes.
So, because they've been used to military routines.
Right.
So, this is also a learning curve for them.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's really good. Um,
I also have a blog post where I kind of um, I said what to expect during reintegration, and I did it like first week, first couple of months, the next
oh,
few
that's
months,
good.
6 months out, and I talked about expectations for the spouse, but also the service member.
Yes, that's really good. Everyone should definitely check that out. How do you approach reconnecting emotionally and physically, especially when life has changed for one or both spouse? We sort of touched on it. It can be a little awkward, possibly. But do you have something that you'd like to elaborate on that one?
I think you just my best advice is communicate before deployment, during deployment, and return after they've returned home. I think there's some helpful resources out there. The ministry I work with, Crew Military, has a resource. It's like $8. It's called Making Your Marriage Deployment Ready, and it gives you tips on different things to communicate throughout those times. We just have to keep and not shut down. I can't shut down on my spouse, and he can't shut down on me. I like to say we have to remind each other that we are still fighting, not fighting with each other, but we're fighting for our marriage.
That's what I tell everyone on our podcast and anyone I meet. When you are fighting, you should never be fighting to see who wins.
Yes.
You should have the same fight and same goal of we want our marriage to be healthy, and that is why we're fighting.
Yeah. And I think just reminding each other, sometimes we actually had to say this like, hey, we're on the same team.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to skip over just a couple of questions if that's okay,
Yeah,
because we kind
sure.
of touched on them. But what internal narratives or lies do spouses have to confront about strength, failure, or worth as the spouse at home?
Yeah, well, I really believe that our mind is very powerful. And I think that the enemy tries to throw lies our ways, especially when our spouse is deployed. Because if
Yeah,
he can get us to begin to believe the lies, he can pull us down. And I believe the enemy loves to attack marriages, it's one of his specialties. So I think it's just for me, I have to not just tell myself not to have these anxious thoughts or these fearful thoughts or these negative thoughts, but I actually have to push them out. And I like to explain this using the law of displacement. It's a physics law. And we see this come into play when you put your kids in the bathtub. So when you put them in the bathtub, the water level on the bathtub goes up. And that's because the law of displacement tells us that a volume cannot be full of two things at the same time. And I think this applies to our minds. So if I'm feeling fear, anxiety, anger, I can't just tell myself not to have those thoughts. I have to replace them. I have to push them out with faith. And for me, honestly, that looks like going and getting my Bible
Yeah.
and finding some truth to push out the lies that the enemy has told me. I also like to use Philippians 4:8, which I think gives us a formula for how do we actually do this. It tells us that we are not to be anxious, but in everything, by thanksgiving, prayer, and supplication, we are to present our request to God. So it's not just pushing out the anxious thoughts, but it's replacing them with faith by being thankful for when God has been faithful in the past. So for me, that's reminding myself of when God has been faithful, times when He's come through in the past. If I'm really struggling with fear and anxiety, I might not even be able to remember something from my own life. So that's when I start searching the scripture. Okay, God, show me when you've been be faithful. It can be something as simple as reminding myself that, you know what? God allowed the Israelites to pass through the Red Sea on dry land, and then He protected them throughout, the years of wandering in the wilderness. And I can say, you know what? That God is faithful. And that is the same God that I serve, or just I like to keep little notebooks of different things that I struggle with in my thought life that are scriptures that remind me of truth. And so I'll just pop that out, or I've got notes on my phone on different areas that I know that I struggle, because I know I can't just tell myself not to have these negative thoughts. I have to feed myself faith with the truth of the word of God.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something else that I think listeners might respond to as well is something my mom actually said yesterday. So I was
Awesome.
sitting here at my desk, and my desk is in the laundry room because that's where we had room. So I
Well, it's
have,
a lovely laundry room.
thank you. So I have a washer and dryer in my viewpoint. And she said when she gets overwhelmed or anxious, she used to pause, breathe, but look around the room at objects and either admire their beauty and try and see the beauty in them, or look at the object and think, how grateful I am that God blessed me with that object
Mhm.
or whatever it is that you're seeing, and think about those that don't have it and
Yeah.
how you use it.
Yeah, it's
And
just
that will,
thankfulness.
yeah, and that will bring you more positivity, and it tends to calm you down. And I looked over and I said, I'm looking at my washer and dryer right now, and all I can think is people have to go to the laundromat.
Yeah.
They have to, some people are washing their clothes in a river.
Mhm.
Like, I'm so grateful for that. So I thought that was a lovely way of putting it
Yeah,
too.
that's great. And I also will go outside. There's something for me about being outside that helps me kind of get calm. And I think what our natural temptation though is to just wallow up in our misery and
Yes,
feed that.
yes,
Um, even like I follow some military spouse readers Facebook pages where they're feeding their negative emotion by what they're reading. And I don't think that's healthy. I think we have to stop that negative emotion. And for me, that means I need to get around other people that can help point me to truth when I'm really struggling. So even though I want to wallow up and sit on my couch and cry and watch sad movies, I say, you know what? I can't do this. I know I need to get out in a positive environment, get outside and go be around people, even if it's uncomfortable, because I can't feed that fear.
yeah. My dad used to say, you lay down with dogs, you get up with fleas. And it translates to, you are what you put around you.
Yeah,
And
for
so
sure.
if you are with people that are fueling that flame, you will always have that anger or think that way about that situation.
Hmm.
But if you put people around you that have a positive mindset or a spiritual mindset, you will start to feel and think that way as well.
Yeah. And I think too, we have a lot of ways to find out great information. There's social media, there's the news. I mean, we've got people taking videos real time of combat situations now that we didn't have when I was an early
Oh,
military spouse.
yeah. Yeah.
But we did have the news. And I remember one time, watching the news and they were talking about the surface to air missiles where my husband was deployed and how, there was no visibility because there was so much fire and so much smoke. And I found myself reeling and just kind of anxiety beginning to seize me. And I was like, you know what? I got to turn this off because this is not helpful. And honestly, there's nothing I can do about it, anyways. But I could pray and I could say, I'm going to turn off this, which is causing me increased anxiety, and turn to something that is positive, which for me often is the word of God.
Absolutely. That reminded me of when I was with my ex-husband. He was Army and deployed in Iraq, and I couldn't. We had an argument and we hung up on each other. And then, like, few hours went by, I couldn't get a hold of him, and something popped up on the news saying that a Humvee was hit,
Mm,
and that they cut all communication and stuff like that until they let the families know. And so I got instantly nervous, and
hmm.
it turned out his Humvee was hit.
Oh,
He
wow.
called me the next day, so a whole day went by before I heard. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt. He had a busted eardrum, but
Oh,
so I think another point to say about deployment is, if you can help it, do not leave your conversations in a negative manner.
hmm. Yeah, that's a great thought. We learned to start our conversations with, "Hey, I love you. I'm on your team. I'm committed." And then go into the, "Wow, let me tell you what the kids did today," or, "Wow, the car broke down. We were on the we were on the side of the road." Because initially I was starting with all the negative stuff, and we weren't getting to the time to reconnect because time was limited. We just didn't have a lot of time. So we learned to start our conversations to remind each other.
I think
Um,
that's a good idea too. If you still have a moment, I have two more questions,
Sure.
and I
Yeah,
think
we can
they're
do it.
really quick. What are some healthy boundaries to put into place during deployments on either spouse's side?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that it's a temptation on both sides of the ocean. Uh, you know, all of us can be tempted, all of us, right? And we have to protect our thought life and our mind, what we see. Um, so boundaries are good. One thing that we did is that we would not spend one-on-one time with someone of the opposite gender on deployment. That was easy for me because I was the spouse at home. There are women serving in uniform, right? But we did it to the best of our ability. But what that meant is that if my husband's going, out to dinner with people on deployment, he's not going to just go with one female, right? He's just not going to go. Now, there are times you have to, talk to a fellow soldier or airman who's of an opposite gender. But even then, to the best of your ability, try to have an open door policy, unless it's something very sensitive. And then accountability partners are really necessary for both of us. I think you need someone to be asking you, "Hey, how are you doing? How are you, are you crossing any lines?" And I think part of that is realizing that most affairs start with an emotional affair first. So we're just not going to allow ourselves to go there emotionally with someone of the opposite gender. And then I think something that statistically and research is showing that is not good, that maybe will not be popular, is that I don't think porn use is good on deployment. Porn use is actually going to make your intimacy harder when you get home because your brain is used to a higher level of stimulation. And then porn addiction leads to depression and lack of empathy. So you may think that it's harmless on deployment, but it is really upsetting your intimacy in your marriage by engaging in that. And yes, I understand. I've not been on deployment because I never wore the uniform, but I understand it's everywhere, and it's a very common thing that people will use to relieve the stress. Um, but I do think that it is dangerous in how it can affect your intimacy. So that's a boundary that I asked my spouse to do, and was something that I didn't do as well. And I think porn use is super prevalent in men and women now, but we just need to recognize it's a way we can protect our mind and our marriage in the future. It's an investment in our future marriage.
Yeah, when we spoke on porn on our podcast, it releases July 17th. It's the dangers of pornography. And we go into the psychological effects, the physical effects, the emotional damage. Um, we go into the spiritual aspect of it. But if you are
Right.
truly trying to center your marriage in Christ,
Mm-hmm.
you have to think, what does pornography really portray
Yes.
as me being a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
Is it giving God the glory, or am I lusting after others?
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that God calls us not to lust.
Yes.
So that is something that I feel very strongly about, and it is not a popular opinion, but I do
I
believe.
posted about it on social media one time, and it was the most commented thing because people wanted to argue with me.
Yeah, we even spoke on what if the marriage, they share pornography, like they do it together. Is that okay? And we even spoke on that. So
Mm-hmm.
if you guys are interested, definitely check that out. But I
That's great.
completely agree with you. If you could offer one promise from God's word to a fellow military spouse dealing with mental strain, what would it be?
Well, I already mentioned Philippians 4:8, which is how we are not to be anxious and how we're to take those thoughts captive and replace them with faith and thanksgiving. I'm actually going to give you two. So, one is this is not so related to deployment, but I like to call it the military verse in scripture. It's Acts 17:26. And it says, God determined in advance the places you would live and the times that you would live there. And then it goes on to say, so that God might be glorified. And then it talks about being conformed to the image of Jesus. I love that scripture because God has determined in advance the times and the places that you would live there. So every assignment you get, every house that you live in, every base house, every house you rent, maybe you buy, all of your neighbors, that is God's perfect plan for you. It's his plan to transform you, to make you look more like Jesus, but also for you to be on mission for him, to be impacting the kingdom of the people around you. But I find so much comfort in knowing, and we moved 14 times. Every assignment was filtered through God's loving hands. And we got quite a few assignments that we did not want, that we were quite disappointed when my husband, got the word from his commander. But those were God's assignments that were going to make us look more like Jesus and help us better be able to impact the people around us. And I think I learned that attitude was everything. But I do want to mention the life of Sarah because I think that Sarah holds many parallels to the military spouse. God called Sarah and Abraham to go to a land that he would call them. That is a permanent change of station, or PCS. And they were doing it often. They were transitioning. They went to Egypt. They went to Bethel. They went to Oaks of the Marm. Um, they went back to Egypt. They were always on the move. And then on top of that, Abraham was a warrior. He went off and fought in a combat deployment when he went off to rescue his nephew Lot from the four kings and all of their armies. And this was brutal combat deployment. And God protected him. Abraham, with his 318 men, went off to fight, much outnumbered, much outtrained. But God showed up and showed that when he shows up with his clout and command, nothing can get past him. And so I just want to encourage people to realize the power of God and really look to Sarah's story in Genesis 12 through 22 that I personally believe has so many parallels to a military spouse life, and realize God has his eye on you, military spouse. He cares about you, and he is intimately involved in the intricacies of your life, and he can be trusted to be steadfast and secure in the chaos and uncertainty of your military wife life.
I love that. Thank you so much for being on today. I thank you to the listeners. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close out?
Yeah, just the only thing is what I mentioned about Sarah. I have a book about that. It's for military wives. It's based on Genesis 12 through 22. It's called Another Move God, and it's a 30-day devotional that is specifically written to that military wife. And then For your listeners that are not military, I want to encourage you to engage the military in your midst. They are lonely, they have chaos in their life, and they need the love of God. So I want to encourage you today to reach out to them, to let them know that you care. Just extend yourself by welcoming the next time you meet someone and letting them know that you want to be their friend.
Yeah, I agree. All right, thank you so much. If anyone needs to reach out to Miss Beth, you can get with her on her website. You can also contact me and I can get with her and connect you. I'm sure she'd be happy to hear from you. And again, her website is on boundbygracepodcast.com. And I really appreciate all of our listeners, and you guys have a wonderful day.
And thank you, Amber, for your family's sacrifice to serve our nation in uniform.
Thank you, yours as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.